My son sold their house and turned over $600,000 for my daughter-in-law to manage, and afterward they came to live beneath my roof as if nothing had changed. I had lived a life of sacrifice, never believing I would meet such challenges so late in my years. Each day under the same roof reminded me how swiftly trust can shift. I carried on, unaware that one quiet evening would bring the first sign of what was yet to come. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. When I first speak these words, people raise their brows in disbelief, and I cannot blame them. To hear that a man's only son would sell the very house he raised his family in, a house that had been built with the help of my labor and my savings, and then give away $600,000 to his wife as if it were a small allowance, sounds unreal. Yet it is as real as the air I breathe and the memories I carry. I am an old man now, but I have lived long enough to know that sometimes the wounds cut deepest not from strangers, but from the hands of those you once trusted with your heart. The day it all began was a quiet one. The sun streamed through the curtains of my modest living room, the same living room that had seen my children grow, my wife smile, and my family gather around the table for meals filled with laughter. I was sitting in my chair with a cup of tea, a book resting on my knee when my phone rang. I remember the weight of that call because it was not just another conversation, it was the moment that changed the direction of my life. My son's voice on the other end was rushed, almost careless, as he explained what he had done. He spoke of selling the house, of money changing hands, and of plans he said were too big for me to understand. My heart pounded in my chest. My fingers tightened around the receiver, and for a long moment I could not find my words. I had worked my whole life to give him a foundation. From the time he was a boy, I taught him that hard work builds not only a home but a future. When he wanted his first car, I helped him. When he went to school, I paid for the things his part-time jobs could not cover. When he married, I gave him the wedding he dreamed of. And when he bought his first house, I was there with the down payment to make it possible. I believed I was building him a better life. A life where he would stand tall and strong on his own. I never once thought that foundation would be torn down so quickly by his own decisions. In that moment, sitting alone with the phone pressed to my ear, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Confusion clouded my mind. Was this truly my son, the boy I had once held in my arms, the man I had called my pride? Pride can blind a father. I realize that now. It can make you think your sacrifices are enough to shape the choices of your child. But choices are born from within, and his choice was one I never expected. He had not only sold the house, but he had handed the money to his wife, as if the years of labor and sacrifice behind that house meant nothing at all. I remember asking him why. The word came out of my mouth more as a whisper than a question. His reply was quick and sharp. He said she had dreams, that $600,000 would give her the freedom she deserved, that she would make something out of it. But what does a dream mean when it is built on the ashes of another man's sacrifice? What freedom comes from squandering the very foundation that was meant to carry you forward? These were the thoughts racing in my head, though I said little of them aloud. A father's first instinct is often to listen, to hope, to believe that perhaps his child knows what he is doing. Yet as I sat there, a heaviness grew in my chest. I knew that money given without wisdom is like water poured into sand. It disappears, leaving nothing behind. Still, I held my tongue. I let him speak, let him explain, even though every word cut deeper. Little did I know, that was only the beginning. For not long after, my son and his wife would appear at my doorstep, not as guests, not as family coming for a visit, but as people who believed they had a right to take over the home I had built for myself. And that is where the real story begins. When I think back to the first blow, the moment when the weight of my son's choices truly crashed down upon me, it was as if the air had been pulled from my lungs and the world around me lost its balance. For it was not simply the news that he had sold the house, it was the way it was told, with no pause for reflection, no acknowledgement of what that house meant, and no recognition of the sacrifices that had been poured into its foundation. And as I sat with the phone pressed against my ear, the words tumbled through my mind like loose stones rolling down a hill, each one hitting harder than the last, until finally the silence between us grew heavier than the conversati on itself, because I could not comprehend how something so precious could be gone in the blink of an eye, a house that had taken years of saving, years of long shifts, years of tired mornings and aching backs, a house I had helped him secure when the bank said no, a house that represented security, continuity, and the promise of a future, now reduced to nothing more than a line on a sales contract, erased without so much as a thought, to the history written in its walls, the laughter of children, the warmth of family dinners, and the memories that still lingered in every corner. And as the realization sank in, disbelief gripped me harder than grief, because grief comes with the passing of something inevitable, but disbelief comes with the shock that something you trusted to stand firm has been ripped away by choice, and I found myself asking again and again if I had heard him correctly, repeating his words in my head, trying to find sense where there was none. And in that instant I remembered the day we walked through that house for the very first time, my son smiling as he spoke of the rooms his children would one day fill, my daughter-in-law holding his arm as if she shared in that dream, and me standing behind them, feeling proud that I had helped open this door for them, proud that the years of sacrifice had led to this, and now all of it was gone, not lost to a storm or a fire, not taken by forces beyond control, but surrendered willingly, and worse still, surrendered recklessly, as if the blood and sweat behind it were worth no more than dust, and I sat there staring the wall in front of me, the sound of his voice still echoing in my ear, unable to speak, unable to even ask the questions burning in my chest, questions like why he had not consulted me, why he had not paused to think of the weight of such a choice, why he had not valued what had been given. And though my lips parted, the words would not come, because the shock was too heavy, the disbelief too strong, and the silence too deep. And all I could do was sit there, holding the phone long after the call had ended, as though keeping it close might somehow undo the words I had just heard. But of course it could not. And the truth of what had happened settled in like a stone at the bottom of a river, immovable and undeniable, and I knew then that something had shifted in a way that could never be undone. For a father builds not just with bricks and mortar, but with trust. And when that trust is broken, the crack runs deeper than the foundation of any house. It runs through the heart itself, and in that moment, disbelief became my companion. And though I did not yet know it, that disbelief was only the beginning of a storm that would test everything I thought I knew about my son, about family, and about the true cost of sacrifice. When I think of the years of sacrifice that led us to that house, my heart aches with a weight that words can barely hold, for I can still see the long days that began before the sun rose and ended long after it set, the endless hours where I wore my hands down to the bone and my back carried burdens heavier than my years should have allowed, because I believed in the promise of a future for my son, and I was willing to give everything to see him stand taller than I ever did. And so I worked 2 jobs, often coming home too late to enjoy a warm meal, too tired to share in laughter, but always determined that every drop of sweat had purpose, that every aching step meant progress. And when others asked me why I pushed myself so hard, I answered with quiet resolve that a father does what must be done, because when you have a child looking to you for guidance, you find strength you never thought possible, and those years piled one upon another, seasons changing outside while inside I counted every dollar, scrimping here, cutting corners there, saving what little I could so that one day he would not know the hunger I knew in my youth, so that he would never have to beg for opportunity or watch it slip through his fingers. And though I often missed out on simple joys, I did not complain, for in every sacrifice I made I could see the outline of his future forming. The down payment on a car, the tuition for his schooling, the bills that appeared faster than the paychecks, all met by the quiet endurance of a father's love. And I remember the winters when I walked home in the biting cold, my coat threadbare, but my spirit held warm by the thought that I was building something greater than myself. And I recall the summers when the sweat soaked through my shirt, the heat pressing against my skin, but I pressed harder still, because I knew that with each day of labor, I was one step closer to giving him the stability he deserved. And in those moments when exhaustion nearly broke me, when my legs trembled and my hands stiffened, I looked at his face and told myself it was worth it. And that belief kept me moving forward year after year, for sacrifice without purpose is misery. But sacrifice with love is a foundation strong enough to carry generations. And that was what I believed I was doing, building a legacy not of wealth for myself, but of security for him. And though I sometimes wondered if he noticed the tired lines deepening in my face or the weariness I tried to hide, I always chose to believe that he saw my effort and would one day honor it. And when he finally grew older and began to dream of a home for himself, I was there without hesitation, dipping into savings I had guarded for decades, watching as the dollars I had worked so hard to keep safe vanished into the paperwork of a down payment, and I did it gladly. Because in that moment it felt like everything had come full circle, as if the sacrifices of my youth had blossomed into something solid, a home where he could start a family, a place where laughter could echo once again. And though the path to that house was paved with my pain, I never begrudged it, for I believed that giving him more than I ever had was the truest measure of a father's love. And as I think back now, I realize those sacrifices were not just acts of labor, but acts of faith, faith that my son would take what I had built and carry it forward with respect, faith that the years I gave away from my own life would be repaid not in money, but in gratitude. And though the reality of how it all turned out has left me scarred, I cannot erase those years from my memory, for they remain a testament to the strength of a father's heart and the lengths to which love will drive a man who believes in his child, even if that belief costs him more than he could ever have imagined. I remember the day of the wedding, as if it were painted in colors brighter than any other memory, for it was not just a celebration of 2 young people coming together. It was the culmination of all the hopes and dreams I had carried for my son since the day he was born. And when he stood before me in his suit, nervous but proud, I felt that perhaps all the years of sacrifice had led to this moment, and I wanted to make it perfect. So I spared no expense, pouring my savings into the day, believing that the start of their marriage deserved to be blessed with abundance. And as I signed checks for the venue, the flowers, the food, and the music, I did so without hesitation, not because I had excess to give, but because I believed love, when honored properly, was worth every penny. And when guests arrived, dressed in their finest, I watched the joy on their faces as they admired the arrangements, the decorations, and the smiles of the bride and groom. And in those hours I felt a peace I had not known in years, for it seemed to me that my son had found someone who would cherish him, someone who would walk with him through life's hardships and triumphs, someone who would bring light into our family. And when she entered the hall, radiant in her gown, I thought to myself that perhaps I had been blessed twice, once with a son, and now with a daughter by marriage. And I welcomed her into my heart with open arms, telling myself that the money I had spent was not just for a single day, but for the promise of a lifetime of happiness. And as I stood to give my toast, my hands trembling, no tea from age, but from emotion, I spoke of the importance of patience, respect, and unity, words I hoped would echo in their hearts long after the music faded. And I remember looking at her as I spoke, noticing the way she held my son's hand, the way she smiled, and I told myself she truly loved him, and I believed then that she would bring kindness into his life, that she would lift him up in ways I could not, and that she would honor the family he came from. And when the night ended and the hall emptied, I was left standing with the bill in my pocket and an empty wallet in my hand, but my heart was full, and I felt no regret. For money can be earned again, but the chance to give your child a beginning filled with joy comes only once. And though I was tired from the weeks of planning, from the endless phone calls and the details that had demanded my attention, I carried myself home with a smile, believing that all had been worth it. And as I watched them drive away to their honeymoon, I whispered a prayer for their union, asking that love would guide them through the storms ahead, never imagining how quickly those storms would come, never suspecting that the very generosity I had shown on that day would one day be taken for granted, twisted into entitlement rather than remembered as love. But in that moment, none of those fears crossed my mind, for I was a father content, believing that my son had stepped into the next chapter of his life with a partner who would not only stand beside him, but also respect the sacrifices that had carried him there. And as I closed my eyes that night, I felt lighter than I had in years, convinced that the wedding had marked the beginning of something lasting, something sacred, and something that would finally bring peace to the old man who had given everything for the sake of his child. It did not happen all at once, but little by little, like shadows stretching across a room as the sun begins to set, I started to notice the change in attitude after the wedding, a subtle shift at first, so slight that I dismissed it as adjustment or stress. Yet over time, those small moments gathered weight. And soon the son I had known all my life seemed to be drifting away, while the woman I had welcomed so warmly into our family grew bolder in ways I could not have predicted. And it began with the silences, the missed phone calls, the way he no longer sought my advice as he once did. And when we spoke, his words seemed shorter, clipped, as if my presence was no longer a comfort but an obligation. And though it pained me, I told myself this was simply the natural course of marriage, that a man's loyalty must first belong to his wife, and I did not begrudge that, for I understood it well. But what I did not understand was how quickly respect turned into disregard, and how that disregard spread like a creeping vine through every corner of our relationship. For soon she began to speak with tones that held no softness, her words sharpened with entitlement, and when she visited my home, I felt more like a servant than a father in his own house. As she would point out things she thought outdated, furniture she found unsightly, rules she found inconvenient, and though I bit my tongue and told myself patience was the better road, Inside, I felt the sting of being treated not as a father or elder, but as someone who had outlived his usefulness. And there were moments when my son stood beside her, silent, not defending me as I had so often defended him, but allowing her words to hang heavy in the air. And that silence cut deeper than the words themselves, for it told me that in his heart he was no longer standing with me, but with her. And I could not fault him for loving his wife, but I could not understand how love had turned into blindness, how he could not see that the tone she used with me chipped away at the foundation of our family. And I recall one evening when they came to dinner, the table set with the same care I had always given to family meals, and she arrived with a look of disdain, pushing her plate aside, whispering to him in a way she thought I would not notice. And when I asked if something was wrong, she smiled politely, but her eyes told the truth. A truth that said nothing here was good enough for her. Not the food, not the home, not the man who had built the life that had made their own possible. And as the weeks turned into months, that look became more frequent, that tone more common, until I realized I was no longer seen as a father or even as a man worthy of respect, but as an obstacle standing in the way of what she believed she was owed. And my son, once the boy who ran to me with questions and laughter, now stood taller beside her, not in strength but in distance. And the bond we once shared seemed to thin until I wondered if it would vanish entirely. And though I tried to hold on to hope, tried to tell myself that perhaps time would soften her edges and bring back the warmth I thought I saw on their wedding day, a voice inside me whispered that something far deeper had changed, that love had been replaced with greed, that gratitude had given way to entitlement. And though I did not want to believe it, I could feel it in every cold glance, every sharp word, every silence where once there had been closeness. And it was in those moments that I realized the greatest pain a father can feel is not in his body, but in his heart. Watching the child he raised slip away, not because of distance or death, but because of choices and attitudes that grow like cracks in glass, small at first, but spreading until the whole structure threatens to break. The day I learned about the $600,000 was the day my heart sank deeper than it ever had before, for until then, I had been clinging to the hope that the distance and the change in attitude were nothing more than passing clouds that would soon drift away. But the truth revealed itself in a way that shattered whatever illusions I had left. And it came not through a direct conversation, but through fragments of words overheard, pieces of talk that I slowly put together until the picture stood clear before me. And what I saw left me shaken. For my son had not only sold the house, but had taken the money, the very heart of his security, and placed it in the hands of his wife under the reasoning that it was to support her dreams. A phrase that sounded noble at first, but fell hollow when I began to see what those dreams truly meant. And I remember sitting in my chair, my hands trembling, as he explained it to me in a tone that suggested he believed he was doing something grand, something visionary, and he spoke of opportunities and ventures, of freedom and independence. But I heard between the lines the truth, that this money was not being used to build a future, not being invested in something lasting, but was instead flowing into luxuries that disappeared as quickly as they were bought: fine clothes, glittering jewelry, expensive trips, meals in places where the cost of one dinner could feed a family for weeks. And as he talked, I looked at his face and tried to see the boy I once knew, the boy who used to be careful with every dollar, who once sat with me, learning how to balance a checkbook, who once celebrated small savings as if they were treasures. And I could not reconcile that boy, with the man who now brushed aside $600,000 as if it were pocket change. And worse still, I could not reconcile the woman who now stood beside him, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as though this money were her right, her reward, and I thought of all the years of toil that had gone into building that security. Not only mine, but his as well, and how quickly it had all been turned into dust, and I tried to find the words to caution him, to remind him that money spent without thought leaves behind only regret. But he cut me off, insisting that I did not understand, that times had changed, that she was different, that she had visions too grand for me to grasp. And as he spoke, my heart grew heavy, for I knew that dreams without discipline are nothing more than fleeting shadows, and I could see with my own eyes that her visions were not of building something for the future, but of enjoying everything in the present. And I sat in silence, my thoughts spinning, remembering the countless sacrifices that had brought us here, remembering the house that had once stood as a symbol of stability, now gone, and the money that could have been their safety net, now wasted. And I asked myself if perhaps I had been blind all along, if perhaps I had mistaken entitlement for ambition. And in that moment I felt the sharp cut of betrayal, not because the money was gone, but because trust had been broken, because my son had chosen to place everything in the hands of a woman who valued none of it. And as I watched them walk away that day, their laughter carrying through the air as if nothing were wrong, I felt the ground shift beneath me. And I knew in my heart that this revelation was only the beginning of a storm that would test me more than any hardship I had ever endured. For the $600,000 was not just money, it was the symbol of years of sacrifice reduced to ashes. And the knowledge that it had been given away so recklessly burned deeper than any wound I had ever carried before. I will never forget the day they stood before me with their bags at the door, their eyes carrying neither shame nor hesitation, only the firm expectation that I would open my home to them as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And that was the moment when the demand to move in was laid bare, a demand not wrapped in humility or apology, but presented as if I owed them this shelter, as if the roof I had built for myself with my own sweat and years of sacrifice was theirs by right. And though they tried to disguise it as necessity, speaking of how they had no choice after losing the house, how circumstances had left them with nowhere else to turn, I could see the truth etched in their posture and in the tone of their voices, for there was no gratitude, only insistence, and I stood there with my hand still on the doorframe, my heart caught between anger and sorrow, remembering the boy who once held my hand on walks home from school, the son who once looked up at me with trust in his eyes, and now seeing a man who looked at me not with love but with expectation, and beside him she stood, her presence louder than words, her smile confident as though she had orchestrated this moment, and it was clear she felt victorious, as though taking residence under my roof was not an act of desperation, but the fulfillment of something she believed she deserved. And as I let them in, my mind filled with the weight of all the years I had carried them. The down payment for their home, the bills I had helped cover, the wedding I had paid for, and now here they were, asking not for guidance or a helping hand, but for the very space I had carved out for myself in my old age, a place I had hoped would be my sanctuary. And as I watched them carry their bags into the hallway, I felt the quiet unraveling of my peace, for I knew this would not be a short stay. I knew that once they crossed that threshold, they would not see themselves as guests, but as rightful occupants. And the thought chilled me, because a home is more than walls and windows. It is the soul of the one who built it, and I could already sense that my soul would soon be tested, and though I wanted to speak, to tell them this was not the way things were meant to be, my voice faltered, for a father's heart still hesitates when it comes to denying his child, and so I stepped aside, watching them move in. Each bag they set down feeling like a stone placed upon my chest, and though I tried to remind myself that perhaps this was only temporary, that perhaps hardship had humbled them, and they would find their footing again, the way they walked through my home told me otherwise, their eyes scanning the rooms not with humility, but with ownership, their footsteps echoing not with gratitude, but with entitlement, and I stood quietly, my hands trembling at my sides, realizing that what had once been my refuge had now become their domain, and though I had let them in with the hope that family ties could be honored, deep within me, I knew that this demand, presented so boldly and accepted with such arrogance, was the beginning of a storm that would rage under my roof and test every ounce of patience and resolve I had left in me. The first days after they moved in were quiet enough, but it did not take long before the true colors began to show. And soon my own home, the place I had cherished as a sanctuary of peace and order, no longer felt like mine, for instead of living as grateful guests, they acted as though they had taken ownership, speaking over me, rearranging things without asking, and treating my rules as though they were meaningless. And I will never forget the first time she walked into my living room and told me that the furniture looked outdated, that the curtains were too plain, and before I could even answer, she was pulling at the fabric, telling my son to help her move the chairs so the space could feel more modern. And I stood there watching, stunned by the audacity, my chest tightening as the life I had carefully arranged for myself was shifted without so much as a question, and my son, instead of stopping her, instead of reminding her that this was his father's home, simply nodded and carried on as if it were his duty to follow her wishes. And with every passing day the small changes grew into larger ones until my kitchen was no longer mine. My schedule was no longer mine. Even the quiet moments I once enjoyed in my own chair with a book in hand were interrupted by the sound of their voices telling me how things ought to be done, and when I would speak up, suggesting that perhaps in this house we might follow certain rules or show a little respect, I was met with laughter or a dismissive glance, as if my words carried no weight at all, and it hurt more than I can describe. For to be a father who spent decades building a foundation only to find himself treated like an unwelcome guest in his own home is a wound deeper than any physical pain. And I recall one evening when I asked that the television be turned down so I could read, and she looked at me with a smirk and said that I needed to learn to adapt, that times had changed, and that the house should feel alive. And my son, instead of defending me, simply shrugged and turned the volume even higher, and I felt my heart sink, for in that moment I realized the bond between father and son had been overshadowed by her influence, and the respect I once thought unshakable had been eroded to dust. And the more I endured these slights, the more I understood that they did not see themselves as temporary residents, they saw themselves as rulers, and every corner of my house became a stage for their entitlement. From the way they filled the refrigerator without asking to the way they invited friends over as if I were invisible. And though I tried to remain calm, tried to remind myself that patience was a virtue, I could not ignore the tightening in my chest each time I walked into a room and found it rearranged, each time I spoke and my voice was drowned out by theirs. And in those days I began to feel like a stranger in my own life, walking through familiar halls that no longer belonged to me, and the bitter truth settled slowly but firmly in my mind that they had not come to live with me out of necessity alone, but to take, to control, and to strip away the dignity of the father who had given them everything. And as I lay in bed at night, listening to the muffled sounds of their voices echoing through the walls, I felt a sorrow deeper than silence. For I knew then that the disrespect festering under my roof was not a passing phase, but the new reality I would have to endure until I found the strength to change it. One evening, when I thought the weight of their presence could not grow heavier, I overheard something that struck me harder than all the disrespect and disregard I had endured. For as I walked down the hall toward the kitchen, I heard the voice of my daughter-in-law carrying proudly through the air as she spoke to her friends on the phone, her laughter ringing with triumph as she bragged not only about the $600,000 she now controlled, but also about how she had taken charge of my household. And I stood there frozen just beyond the doorway, the sound of her words cutting through me like a cold wind as she declared that she no longer had to worry about money because my son had given her everything, and that even the old man's home was now hers to command. And the sting of her arrogance left me speechless, for in those words I could hear the truth that she saw me not as a father-in-law to respect, but as an obstacle she had already conquered. And worse than her boast was the way she mocked the sacrifices that had made her comfort possible. Laughing as she told her friends how she had turned my son into a man who would do anything, she asked, even if it meant betraying his own father, and the sound of that laughter settled deep into my bones, colder than any winter I had ever endured, for I realized then that her sense of control was not imagined, but real, that she took pride in diminishing me, that she found joy in reducing me to a figure of ridicule while she lived under the roof I had built, and I leaned against the wall for support, my heart pounding with disbelief, recalling the years I had spent believing that kindness and sacrifice would always be remembered, only to now find myself cast as a fool in her story of conquest. And though I wanted to step into the kitchen, to confront her, to demand respect, something inside me told me to stay silent, to listen, because her words revealed more than any argument could. And as she went on boasting about her power, about how she had reshaped the life of my son and claimed authority over me, I understood that she did not see this arrangement as temporary. She saw it as permanent. She saw it as her victory. And the thought left me trembling. For it was one thing to endure disrespect in silence, another to know that the disrespect had been spoken aloud, shared proudly with others, turned into a story that fed her pride. And as I stood there hidden by the shadows, I felt the weight of betrayal pressing against me harder than ever, because it was no longer just her actions, but her words that revealed the truth, that she had no intention of showing gratitude, no intention of offering respect, no intention of ever seeing me as anything but an old man she had conquered. And as she laughed again, her voice echoing through the hall, I turned quietly and walked back to my room, each step heavier than the last, knowing that I could no longer ignore what had been unfolding before me. For her boast was not just idle talk. It was the reflection of a heart filled with arrogance. And it was the confirmation I needed that the peace of my home had been stolen not by accident, but by design. And though my chest ached with sorrow, a small spark began to stir deep inside me, a spark that whispered that there would come a day when her laughter would no longer echo through these halls. A day when the boast she shared so proudly would crumble into silence, though at that moment all I could do was carry the weight of her words back into the solitude of my room, where I sat in the darkness and wondered how the love of a son could have been twisted into the weapon that now struck at my very soul. As I sat alone in the quiet of my room, the echoes of her boast still stinging in my ears, my mind began to drift back to all the moments in my life when people had warned me, when voices of reason tried to caution me about the path I was walking with my son, and I remembered how I always brushed those words aside, choosing instead to believe that my love and sacrifice would be enough to guide him, and the memories came rushing in one after another, like pages of a book I had tried to close but could no longer ignore. And I thought of the friend who once told me that giving too much without teaching responsibility would breed entitlement. Yet I smiled and said he did not understand a father's heart. And I thought of my brother who once shook his head and told me I was spoiling the boy, that one day he would take more than I could bear to give, and I laughed it off, convinced that gratitude would protect us from such a fate. And I thought of neighbors who watched me work long hours only to spend my savings on my son's needs, who whispered quietly among themselves that I was raising him to believe life would always be handed to him, but I ignored them, telling myself they were envious or simply did not know the bond we shared. And as I replayed those warnings, I realized with a heaviness in my chest that every word they spoke had carried truth, truth I refused to see, because love can blind a man more than pride ever could. And I had convinced myself that the more I gave, the stronger his character would become, that generosity would breed generosity, that kindness would echo into gratitude. But now, sitting in my own house that no longer felt like mine, listening to the arrogant laughter of the woman he had chosen, I saw that I had built not a legacy of gratitude, but a chain of entitlement. And though it hurt to admit, I could not escape the truth that I had played a part in this downfall, that my defense of him, my constant shielding, my refusal to let him face hardships on his own had shaped him into the man who now stood silently while his wife disrespected me, and the pain of that realization cut deeper than any insult they could throw, because it was the pain of knowing that in trying to protect him, I had failed to prepare him. And I recalled specific moments with sharp clarity, like the time he lost money foolishly, and I covered it for him, telling myself it was just a lesson learned, but never letting him feel the sting of consequences, or the time he spoke to me with impatience in his voice, and instead of correcting him, I told myself it was just youth speaking, that he would grow out of it, and yet here he was grown, and the impatience had hardened into entitlement, and the disregard had matured into disrespect, and I saw now that the seeds had been planted long ago, and though I had watered them with love, what grew was not what I expected, and as these memories filled my heart, I felt the weight of regret pressing down on me, heavier than the disrespect I endured daily. Because regret whispers that it could have been different if only I had listened, if only I had been firmer, if only I had believed those who tried to warn me. But the past cannot be undone, and so I sat there, caught between sorrow for the warnings I ignored and the painful clarity of the present, realizing that the life I had worked so hard to build had become a lesson I would only now begin to learn. And though my heart was heavy, there was a quiet resolve beginning to form within me, the faintest awareness that regret could not change the past, but perhaps it could guide my future. And that realization, though small, gave me the strength to rise from my chair, because I knew the days ahead would demand more from me than I had ever given before. The breaking point came on a morning that began like any other, the sun slipping through the curtains and the sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. Yet what unfolded that day etched itself into my memory as the moment when patience gave way to resolve. For as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in my hand, she entered with an expression that carried neither humility nor courtesy, but the boldness of someone who believed the world owed her more than it could ever give. And she sat across from me with her chin lifted and her eyes fixed firmly on mine. And without hesitation, she told me that it was time I considered signing over part of my property to them so that they could have what she called financial security, and for a long moment I thought I had misheard her, because the audacity of the request was so staggering it seemed impossible. Yet she repeated herself with even more confidence, her voice steady, as if this demand was not only reasonable but expected, and I looked toward my son, hoping to see shame in his face, hoping to hear him correct her, to tell her this was beyond any boundary of decency, but instead he lowered his eyes and remained silent, and that silence spoke louder than any words could, for it told me he agreed, that he had allowed himself to be convinced that my property, the last of what I had built with my hands and guarded with my life, should be theirs to claim. And I felt a rush of heat through my chest as my heart pounded with disbelief, because this was no longer about money or security. This was about the complete erasure of respect, the final stripping away of any honor they should have held for me, as a father and as a man. And I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself as her words rang again in my ears, telling me that if I truly loved them, I would give them what they were asking, and in that moment, the years of sacrifice, the long hours of labor, the endless nights of worry, all flashed before my eyes, and I saw with a clarity sharper than ever that everything I had done for them had not built gratitude but greed. And I sat there staring at the woman who now dared to claim what was never hers, and the son who stood idly by. And I felt the weight of betrayal heavier than ever, for this was not just a request, it was an attempt to strip me of the last piece of dignity I held, and though my lips trembled with the urge to speak, the words did not come. For I knew that if I spoke in anger, my voice would shake, and I refused to let them see me broken. So instead I rose slowly from my chair, my hands still trembling, and I walked out of the room without a word, leaving them behind to whisper to each other. And as I climbed the stairs to my room, the reality settled deep into my chest that this was the breaking point, the line that had been crossed, the moment when love and patience could no longer excuse the arrogance and betrayal, and as I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the floor, I knew I could not continue as I had, that something inside me had to change. For if I allowed this demand to pass unchallenged, then there would be nothing left of me, nothing left of the life I had worked so hard to preserve. And in that silence, I realized that the breaking point was not only the moment they tried to take from me, it was also the moment I began to take back my strength. For though my heart was heavy and my spirit wounded, I knew then that I would not let their greed define the rest of my days, and that realization, painful as it was, became the spark that lit the path to what I would do next. That night after the breaking point, I lay awake in my bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on me like a weight, and every word they had spoken echoed in my mind, her demand for my property, his silence that confirmed his agreement, and the years of sacrifice that had brought us to this moment. And as I turned those memories over and over, I felt something inside me harden in a way it never had before. For up until then I had met every insult, every act of disrespect, with silence or patience, telling myself that love would one day remind them of who I was and what I had given. But lying there in the stillness I understood that my silence had not been seen as love, but as weakness. And the more I gave, the more they took, until even my very home was no longer safe from their entitlement. And so, as I stared into the dark, I felt a cold resolve settle over me. Not the heat of anger that fades quickly, not the sting of sorrow that weighs a man down, but a steady calmness that whispered of action. And I realized that I could no longer simply endure. I had to protect what was mine. Not because of greed, not because of bitterness, but because a man has the right to safeguard the dignity of his labor and the peace of his final years. And I began to replay every moment of their stay under my roof, every time they moved furniture without asking, Every time they raised their voices in my home, every time they dismissed me as though my years and sacrifices meant nothing, and those memories no longer hurt in the same way. Instead, they became evidence, reminders of why he decision before me was necessary. And though my heart ached for the son I had once known, the boy I had raised with tenderness and pride, I could not ignore the truth of the man he had become under her influence, and I told myself that love does not mean surrendering everything until there is nothing left. Love also means knowing when to draw a line, and as that thought rooted itself in my mind, I rose from my bed and sat by the window, the night air cool against my skin, and I whispered a vow to myself that I would not allow them to strip away what I had built, that I would not allow their greed to consume the last of my strength. And in that vow I felt a quiet power return to me, a reminder that age does not make a man helpless, that patience does not mean he cannot act. And as the hours passed and dawn began to break, I felt clarity unlike any I had known in years. For I now understood that the road ahead would not be easy, that it would bring conflict and perhaps estrangement, but I also knew that peace could never be restored by submission. It had to be reclaimed by courage, and so with the first light of morning spilling across my floor, I stood with a steadiness I had not felt in a long time. And though I did not yet know every step I would take, I knew the direction was clear, for cold resolve had replaced wounded silence, and in that resolve was the strength I would need to face them, to protect myself, and to finally draw the line that should have been drawn long ago. The morning after that long night of resolve, I dressed with more care than usual, putting on a clean shirt and steadying my hands as I buttoned it. For I knew that the decision I was about to take would mark the beginning of a new chapter, and with every step out of my house I felt the weight of determination guiding me, heavier than fear but steadier than doubt. And I walked into town with my head low, yet my heart firm, until I reached the office of a lawyer whose name I had kept in my mind for years, though I never thought I would need his services. And as I sat in the chair across from his polished desk, I felt the strange mix of shame and relief, shame that it had come to this point with my own son, but relief that there was finally someone who could help me protect what remained of my life's labor. And when he asked what brought me there, I told him everything. My voice steady at first, but then trembling as I recounted the disrespect, the sale of the house, the $600,000 squandered, the arrogant boast I had overheard, and finally the breaking point when they demanded I sign over part of my property. And as I spoke, I could see in his eyes that he had heard stories like mine before, though perhaps not with the same painful detail. And when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me plainly that I was not powerless, that the law had provisions to protect a man in my position, and hearing those words was like feeling a heavy chain loosen around my chest, for I had been carrying the belief that love and blood tied my hands, that there was nothing I could do but endure. Yet now I learned that endurance was not the only path, that I had the right to safeguard my assets, my home, and my peace. And so we spoke of wills and deeds, of accounts and protections, and he guided me patiently through the steps that would place a shield around what was mine, and with every explanation I felt my resolve grow colder but stronger. For this was no longer about emotion, it was about action. And though my heart still ached with the thought of defending myself against my own son, I reminded myself that I was not taking from him, I was only protecting what I had earned, and the lawyer told me that the sooner I acted, the safer I would be. And so we began drafting papers that would ensure no one could force me to part with my property, securing my accounts so that they could not be touched without my consent, and writing instructions that would keep my intentions clear even after I was gone. And as the pen scratched across the pages, I felt a strange calmness settle over me, as though I were building a fortress around my life, not made of stone and mortar but of legal walls that could not be knocked down by arrogance or entitlement. And when it was done, I sat back in the chair, weary but relieved, and I thanked him with a voice that carried both gratitude and sorrow. For though the process had given me protection, it also reminded me of how far things had fallen, that I had to seek the shelter of the law against the very people who should have been my shelter in old age. And as I walked back home with the papers secure in my bag, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I had finally taken action. Heavier because I knew the storm that would follow once they discovered what I had done. But even with that weight pressing down, I felt steadier than I had in years, for I had chosen not to be silent any longer. And that choice marked the beginning of the battle for my peace. After I left the lawyer's office with the papers secured, I knew that the hardest part of the journey had only just begun, for while the documents gave me protection, they also demanded secrecy. And so I began the silent preparation that would shape the days ahead, a quiet labor carried out behind closed doors, while under my own roof arrogance still walked freely, and each morning I rose with a calm determination, greeting them as though nothing had changed, listening to their complaints and demands, while keeping hidden the truth that their grip on my life was loosening with each passing day. And in the evenings, when they laughed loudly in the living room or boasted on the phone to their friends, I sat in my room at my desk, carefully sorting through old files, moving accounts into safer places, making phone calls in low tones, and signing papers that would fortify my future. And though my hands sometimes trembled as I worked, it was not from fear but from the weight of secrecy. For a father is not meant to hide his actions from his son, yet here I was, keeping silent so that my plan would not be undone. And in that silence I found strength, because each step I took felt like a stone placed in the foundation of a new wall that no arrogance could climb. And as the days went by, I noticed how their behavior grew even bolder, how they spoke of trips they planned without a thought to money, how they moved furniture as if the house were already theirs, how they dismissed my requests with a wave of the hand, and though every act stung, I held my tongue, for I knew that the more they revealed their true selves, the stronger my resolve would grow. And I learned to observe them like a man studying a storm, watching the winds whip and the rain fall while knowing that his own walls were being reinforced from within. And when they asked me questions about my accounts or hinted again about property, I gave vague answers, hiding the truth behind a mask of tired patience. And I could see that they mistook my silence for surrender, but in truth it was the silence of preparation, the quiet gathering of strength that would one day leave them stunned. And in the long hours of the night when the house was still, I would sit by the window with the moonlight spilling across my papers, reviewing every detail, ensuring that no loophole could be twisted against me. And I thought often of my late wife, imagining her voice telling me to be strong, to guard what we had built together. And those thoughts gave me courage, for I knew that my actions were not only for myself, but for the memory of the woman who had walked beside me in sacrifice, and for the dignity of the years we had shared. And so I continued the work, day after day, moving quietly, speaking little, carrying myself with the stillness of a man who had learned that victory does not always come with loud declarations, but with patient preparation. And though my heart still ached each time I saw my son obey her commands without question, I reminded myself that my silence was not weakness now but strategy. And in that knowledge I found the strength to endure their presence, to wait until the time was right, and to trust that the walls I was building in secret would soon reveal themselves in the light of day, stronger than their greed and higher than their arrogance. And so the silent preparation became my companion, steady, patient, and unyielding, as I worked to reclaim the peace that had been stolen from me. The moment of the ultimatum arrived on an afternoon heavy with tension, the kind of day when the air feels thick even inside the house, and I was sitting in my chair reading when my son entered the room with his wife at his side, her expression set with that same familiar confidence that had become her mask. And I could tell before a single word was spoken that something unpleasant was about to unfold. And sure enough, he cleared his throat, shifting uneasily yet still carrying an air of entitlement, and told me that they had been talking, that the time had come for me to show whether I truly loved them. And he said those words with a weight that carried both accusation and demand, and I felt my chest tighten as he went on, telling me that if I cared about their future, I would share my retirement savings with them, that holding on to money while they struggled was selfish, and that love should be proven by action. And I stared at him, listening to words that sounded less like a plea from a son and more like the declaration of someone who believed he was entitled to what he did not earn. And as he spoke, I could see her hand resting firmly on his arm, steadying him, guiding him, her eyes fixed on me with that look that always seemed to say she had already won. And for a long moment, I did not answer, because the rush of emotions inside me was too great. Anger at his boldness, sorrow at his blindness, disbelief that the boy I had raised with love and sacrifice now stood before me, demanding not respect or guidance but money, as though that were the only proof of love, and thou, light back to the years of toil, the long nights when I saved every penny, the sacrifices that carved lines into my face, the patience that kept me moving forward. And I wondered how it had all come to this, how generosity had been twisted into expectation. And yet, as my son continued to speak, pressing his point, I sat in silence, because I knew my words in that moment would not reach him, for his heart was too clouded by her influence, his ears too filled with her whispers, and I let him finish, listening as he told me that if I refused, then perhaps I did not love them as much as I claimed, and those words struck deeper than he could ever know, because love had been the foundation of everything I had done, every sacrifice, every hour of labor, and to hear my love questioned simply because I would not hand over the final piece of my life was the cruelest cut of all. And yet, even in that pain, I felt the cold resolve within me remain steady, reminding me that I had already taken steps to protect myself, reminding me that their demands, no matter how loud, could no longer break me. And so I said little, offering no promise, giving no sign of weakness. And though I saw the frustration flash in his eyes and the smugness in hers, I held my ground in silence, for sometimes silence is the only answer to arrogance. And as they left the room, muttering between themselves, I sat back in my chair and felt the weight of what had just occurred, realizing that this entitled ultimatum was not only their demand, but also my proof, the final confirmation that I had been right to protect myself. And though the pain of betrayal still ached in my chest, beneath it was the quiet strength of a man who had chosen not to bend any further, a man who knew that love may endure much, but it must never surrender everything. And in that knowledge, I found the courage to prepare for the next step, for I knew the time was coming when silence would no longer be enough, and my strength would have to be revealed. The day I finally revealed my strength did not arrive with thunder or shouting, but with a calmness so steady, it surprised even me. For I had carried the weight of their demands and disrespect for so long that when the moment came to speak with clarity, my voice did not tremble. It rang with the firmness of truth. And it happened one evening when they cornered me in the living room once more, pressing again about the retirement money. Her eyes sharp with impatience, and his face filled with that same hesitant obedience to her will. And as they spoke of what they claimed they needed, I raised my hand and asked them to stop. And the silence that followed was heavier than any words that had been spoken before. And into that silence I let my voice flow, steady and unyielding, telling them that their days of freeloading under my roof were numbered, that I had given all I could give and would give no more. And I told them that a father's love is not proven by surrendering his dignity, but by knowing when to protect what is his. And for the first time since they had walked into my house with their bags, I saw the color drain from their faces, because they had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my patience for surrender, and they were unprepared for the strength that now stood before them. And I spoke not with anger, but with resolve, recounting the sacrifices I had made, the years I had worked, the gifts I had given, and the trust I had extended. And I told them that I had watched it all be trampled by greed and arrogance, and though it hurt me deeply to say it, I declared that no more would I allow them to use me. No more would I sit quietly while they dismantled the peace of my home. And as I spoke, I felt the weight of years lifting off my shoulders, as though each word was a stone I had carried for too long. And when I finished, the silence that followed was not mine this time, but theirs, heavy, stunned, and unprepared. And I looked at my son, hoping for even a flicker of the boy I once knew. But all I saw was confusion, as though he did not recognize the man standing before him. And I looked at her and saw anger boiling in her eyes, because control had been her greatest weapon, and she felt it slipping from her grasp. And though the tension in the room was sharp enough to cut the air, I stood with a calmness that held no fear, for I knew the truth of what I had done. I had reclaimed the strength that had always been mine, buried under years of sacrifice and silence, and now brought to the surface by necessity. And as I turned to leave the room, I did not raise my voice, nor slam the door. For true strength needs no theatrics. It is quiet, steady, and undeniable. And in that moment I understood that though the battle was not yet over, the tide had shifted, and I carried within me a power they could neither buy nor bend. The power of a man who has endured much and decided at last that enough was enough. And as I walked back to my room, I knew that whatever storm their anger would bring, I was ready, because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer standing in the shadows of their demands. I was standing tall in the light of my own resolve. The day the eviction papers were served was one of the most difficult and yet most liberating days of my life. For though my heart ached at the thought of turning such a measure against my own blood, I knew there was no other way to reclaim the peace and dignity that had been stolen from me. And when the knock came at the door, it was not unexpected, for I had prepared everything with the lawyer in silence, each step taken carefully, each document signed with the steady hand of a man who knew this was his last defense. And as the officer stood on the threshold with the papers in hand, I watched the faces of my son and his wife shift from casual confidence to stunned disbelief, their laughter silenced, their pride shaken, and for a long moment none of them spoke, as though the weight of the truth pressed too heavily on their tongues. And then the questions began to tumble from their lips, sharp, frantic, filled with denial. How could I do this? What did I mean by this? Surely this was a mistake. But I stood there calm, my hands folded in front of me, my voice steady as I explained that the time of taking without giving was over, that I had endured long enough. that a home built on my labor and sacrifice would not be surrendered to arrogance and disrespect. And I told them that while they had mistaken my patience for weakness, they had now learned that a father may bend, but he does not break. And as the officer placed the papers firmly in their hands, the silence that followed was louder than any argument, for in that silence they were forced to see that I had drawn a line they's tain't. I could not cross, and I looked at my son, hoping for a glimmer of remorse, but all I saw was confusion, anger mingled with disbelief, as though he could not reconcile the man before him with the father he thought he had mastered. And I looked at her, and her eyes burned with fury, because she knew that her control had slipped, that the walls she had built around my son had begun to crumble, and though the sight of their outrage pained me, beneath that pain was a deep relief, for I had taken the step I once thought impossible. And as they stormed through the house, voices raised, demanding explanations, searching for cracks in my resolve, I remained silent, letting the weight of the papers speak for me. For those papers were more than words on a page. They were the shield I had built, the voice of my cold resolve given form, and though the days ahead would no doubt bring bitterness and conflict, I knew that I had done what was necessary. And as I sat alone that evening, the echoes of their shock still ringing faintly in my ears, I felt for the first time in a long time a breath of peace, fragile but real, like the first light of dawn after a long night. And I told myself that no matter what storms came next, the hardest step had already been taken, for I had chosen to protect myself, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the dignity that years of sacrifice and silence had nearly buried forever. The public confrontation came at a family gathering that should have been filled with warmth and laughter, but instead became the stage where truth could no longer remain hidden, and I remember walking into that hall with my head heavy, but my heart steady, for I knew the whispers had already begun. I knew the stories they had told to others painted me as cold and unloving. And I carried with me the decision that I would no longer remain silent, that those who loved me deserved to hear the truth of what had transpired. And as the evening went on, voices rising in chatter, plates clattering with food, and children running about with carefree joy, I felt the weight of eyes on me, waiting for me to speak. And when the moment came, I rose slowly from my chair, my back straight, and I looked across the faces of relatives who had been part of my life for decades, some skeptical, some concerned, and I began to tell the story, not with bitterness, but with clarity, recounting how my son had sold the house I helped him buy, how $600,000 had been handed over recklessly in the name of dreams that were nothing more than indulgences, how they had moved into my home with neither shame nor gratitude, how they had rearranged my life and treated me like a burden in the very house I had built with my own hands. And as I spoke, I saw heads bow, I saw eyes widen, for they had not known the full weight of what I had endured. And then I told them of the demand for my property, of the ultimatum, that if I truly loved them, I would surrender even my retirement savings. And the murmurs that followed told me that the truth was piercing the fabric of lies that had been woven around my name. And I looked at my son as I spoke, my voice steady, and I told him that a father gives love freely, but love is not measured by money. And I turned my eyes to her and said plainly that arrogance and greed can build no home that will stand, and though their faces flushed with humiliation, though they tried to interrupt me with denials and excuses, the tide of the room had shifted, for the family could now see what I had seen all along, and in that moment I felt both sorrow and relief. Sorrow that such words had to be spoken in public, relief that I no longer carried the burden of silence alone, and though my son turned his eyes away, avoiding my gaze, and she stood rigid with fury, unable to mask her anger. I knew that the truth had finally been laid bare for all to see. And as I sat down again, the murmurs grew into quiet support, hands placed on my shoulder, voices whispering that they understood now. And I realized that the confrontation had not been an act of vengeance, but of necessity. For sometimes truth must be spoken aloud where all can hear, so that lies lose their power. And as the night ended and I walked slowly out of the hall, I felt a heaviness lift from me. For I had faced them not in the shadows of my home, but in the light of my family, and in that light their arrogance no longer stood unchallenged. And I knew that though the road ahead was still uncertain, the silence had been broken, and the truth had become my greatest shield. The fall of arrogance came swiftly after the confrontation, as though the very walls they had built around themselves collapsed in one crushing blow, and I watched it happen not with glee, but with the quiet heaviness of a father who had hoped until the end that things might have turned out differently. For once the family knew the truth, their whispers of support became louder than the boasts that had once filled the air, and the image my son and his wife had worked so hard to project cracked under the weight of exposure. And no matter how hard they tried to deny it, no matter how many excuses they scrambled to invent, the fact stood firm before everyone. The house sold, the $600,000 squandered, the disrespect in my home, the demand for my property, and the arrogance that had once made her feel untouchable now clung to her like a cloak of shame. For the friends she had bragged to now avoided her eyes, and the relatives she once dismissed as beneath her now whispered about her downfall. And I saw the anger in her face, the desperate attempts to hold on to control. Yet nothing she said could erase the truth that now lingered in every corner of the room. And my son, who had once walked so proudly beside her, now looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his shoulders hunched, his eyes downcast, and I realized that arrogance can blind a man for a time. But once the light of truth shines upon it, it crumbles faster than sand washed away by the tide. And when the day came for them to pack their belongings and leave my home, the silence was heavier than any shouting could have been, for the bravado they once carried was gone, replaced by bitterness and humiliation. And I stood in the doorway watching as they carried their bags, the same bags they had once brought in with such E-date planks. Entitlement. And I thought of how differently this could have been if gratitude had taken the place of greed, if respect had been chosen over arrogance. And though part of me still longed to see some flicker of remorse in my son's eyes, all I saw was the weight of defeat, and perhaps that was punishment enough. For to fall from arrogance is not only to lose comfort, but to lose the pride that once made you feel untouchable. And as they walked down the path away from my house, the air felt lighter, the silence finally peaceful rather than suffocating. And I whispered to myself that the storm had passed, not because I had fought with rage, but because I had stood firm with resolve. And though the scars on my heart would remain, I knew that their fall was not my triumph, but the inevitable end of arrogance that refuses to see the truth, and in that knowledge I found no joy, only peace, for I had reclaimed what was mine, and they had learned, though too late, that a foundation built on greed will always collapse. When the dust finally settled and the house was quiet once more, I found myself walking from room to room as though reacquainting with an old friend, and the silence that greeted me was no longer heavy with disrespect, but gentle, like a long-awaited embrace. And I realized then that peace is not found in wealth or possessions, but in the simple dignity of living without fear of betrayal under your own roof. And as I sat in my chair by the window where I had once listened to their loud voices echo through the halls, I now heard only the soft rustle of leaves outside and the distant calls of birds, and in that stillness I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the sacrifices that had built the foundation of my son's life, the generosity that had provided for him when he could not provide for himself, the love that had never wavered, even when tested by arrogance and greed, and though the pain of betrayal cut deep, I also felt a strange comfort in knowing that I had stood firm, that I had not allowed my silence to erase my worth, and I thought of the warnings I had once ignored, the words of friends and family who told me I was giving too much. And though regret still lingered in my chest, I reminded myself that love is never wasted, even when it is not returned, because love speaks to the truth of who you are. And as I considered the years ahead, I promised myself that never again would I confuse generosity with weakness. Never again would I allow entitlement to disguise itself as love, and never again would I surrender my peace for the sake of keeping quiet. For life is too short and too precious to be lived in the shadow of another's arrogance, and I know now that respect cannot be bought with sacrifice nor earned by giving beyond your strength. It must come from the heart of those who value you, and if it does not, then standing firm is the only choice left. And as the sun set that evening, casting golden light across the floor of my home, I whispered a prayer for my son, that one day he might see the truth and find the humility that had long escaped him. And I prayed too for myself, that the days ahead would be filled not with bitterness but with peace. And in that quiet moment, I felt the strength of resolve, the calmness of a man who has endured, and the relief of a soul unburdened. And I tell you this now, because stories like mine are not only about pain, they are about learning that dignity must never be surrendered, that even in old age a man has the right to protect what is his, and that peace, once reclaimed, is worth more than all the money squandered in the world. And so I close this chapter of my life with gratitude for the lessons learned, with strength renewed by hardship, and with peace restored within my own walls. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.